Powering today's episode with matcha milk boba. Sweeter than I thought it would be. If you've ever watched any older English language movies or videos that reference mental health professionals, you'll probably catch a weird term used to describe psychiatrists or therapists.
She what? Yeah, she sees a shrink once a week.
The term shrink actually tends to be catch-all slang for any mental health clinician. Psychiatrists, psychotherapists, counselors, you name it, all shrinks. Having a nickname for a profession isn't totally unheard of. Police officers are cops, taxi drivers are cabbies, surgeons are sawbones. Well, at least they used to be sawbones, thanks to the gruesome rate of amputations they performed back in the American Civil War. Okay, so it might be understandable why that nickname fell out of favor. But what in particular gave us the term shrinks? And why does it seem like using this term to describe mental health professionals, it's on its way out? Let's dive in, shall we? There are three common explanations that I found in my research for how the term shrink came to be. First and foremost is from the term head shrinker. Fair warning before I continue, I'm about to get into some pretty graphic details, so here's your chance to fast forward. Don't say I didn't warn you. The term head shrinker is relevant here because of the act of head shrinking, a tradition that used to be practiced by a small group of tribes, the Shuar, Achuar, Huambisa, and Nagaruna. I hope I didn't completely screw up those names. Collectively known as the Javaroan peoples, living in the parts of the Amazon contained within the borders of today's Ecuador and Peru. Essentially, they preserved the decapitated heads of their enemies through a process that included using hot stones to set and boil them, creating sansas, or shrunken heads the size of a fist. It was believed that preparing their enemies' heads this way would ward off or seal away any supernatural spirits that came seeking revenge in the future. Obviously, this is no longer a thing today. The governments of both countries outlawed the practice by the end of the 1930s. Can't believe I'm saying this, but I think this is actually a little bit too sweet. European explorers and anthropologists first came across the practice of head shrinking in the 18th and 19th century, and, weirdly enough, thought these Sansa heads made great souvenirs? In fact, interest in shrunken heads and the tribes creating them grew so much that by the 1930s, even as this practice was getting outlawed in South America, a market for counterfeit shrunken heads was ironically taking off in the West. Then, in 1950, a Time magazine article first dropped the word head shrinker in relation to mental health, quipping that the show Hopalong Cassidy was so surprisingly successful that if someone had predicted the success of the show ahead of time, they'd have been sent to one. Now, I personally feel that the article was trying to make this term a thing, because interestingly enough, there was also a footnote explaining that head shrinker was Hollywood slang for psychiatrists. Also, in a coincidental twist, or maybe just brilliant marketing, this mention was followed by a series of movies about or alluding to the Javaroan tribes. Films like Jungle Headhunters, Back from Eternity, and Javaro would keep the term head shrinker alive in popular discourse. Eventually, references in news, literature, and entertainment continued to increase to the point where the word head shrinker was even mentioned in the movie Rebel Without a Cause. Finally, in Thomas Pynchon's novel, The Crying of Lot 49, the word head shrinker was shortened to just shrink when describing the main character's morally dubious psychotherapist, Dr. Hilarious, who's actually revealed to have serious mental health issues of his own by the end of the novel. And yeah, we've known the word shrink that way ever since. Alright. So we went over head shrinking as a since outlawed ritual. The next possible origin of the term shrink has its roots in phrenology. Phrenology was a field of study from the 19th century that assumed that the shape of your head could provide insight into your personality, intelligence, or moral character. We have this guy, Dr. Franz Josef Gall, to thank for the creation of phrenology, as it stemmed from his early fascination with human anatomy. As a child, he believed that classmates with protruding eyes tended to be better at memorizing. He attributed that trend to those people having brains with larger than usual verbal memory centers, which, to no one's surprise, he hypothesized was right behind the eyes. Phrenology asserted that the brain could be systematically broken down into different regions, each responsible for their own traits or faculties, stuff like combativeness, self-esteem, and color perception. The stronger a person's faculty, the larger the corresponding region of their brain would be. Moreover, the human skull would contour around the brain to accommodate these differences in size and shape, allowing phrenologists to predict certain qualities about a person just from the shape of, or bumps on, their head. Dr. Gall was eventually kicked out out of Austria back in 1805 for fear of his growing field threatening local religious beliefs. However, thanks to American physicians like Dr. Charles Caldwell, his ideas found a warm welcome in the United States, where phrenology flourished. In the 1830s, the Fowler siblings, Orson, Lorenzo, and Charlotte, would come across the teaching of Dr. Gall's protege, Dr. Johann Caspar Spurzheim. While Orson and Lorenzo originally had plans in ministry, they pivoted to making the then science of phrenology a business, selling readings of people's heads that became wildly popular. A 15-year-old Clara Barton's brain revealed that she was unassertive for herself and yet fearless for others, years before she eventually founded the American Red Cross. The future pro-abolitionist preacher, Reverend Henry Ward Beecher's brain, was developed in faculties predicting social intelligence and benevolence. Mark Twain's brain was apparently found lacking in the faculty for humor, which I have to disagree with. I mean, some of the quotes attributed to him are downright hilarious. But beyond the readings, the Fowlers offered something even more useful: lectures and equipment meant to help people strengthen certain parts of their brain. You see, the real power of phrenology lay not simply in understanding how your head shape explained aspects of your personality, but in being able to do something about it. Phrenologists had essentially become bodybuilders, but for the brain. Their belief? Through targeting and exercising certain areas of the brain related to the faculties you wanted, you could literally build a better mental version of you. Fast forward, and many tenets of phrenology were eventually disproven over the years, to the point that it's considered an outdated pseudoscience today. However, as the saying goes, a broken clock is right twice a day. And phrenology certainly had its moments. For example, modern psychology, psychiatry, and neuroanatomy accept the idea that different parts of the brain are responsible for different abilities, although research on mapping the brain reveals that these parts of the brain are all heavily interconnected. So their understanding today isn't as simplistic as phrenologists once believed. Dr. Gall is also credited with distinguishing between gray matter and white matter in the brain. Finally, a small part of phrenology lives on through its impact on everyday speech, including expressions like getting your head examined, well-rounded, and, you guessed it, shrink. As in shrinking the parts of your brain with less than desirable faculties. The final possible explanation I found for the word shrink is a bit more broad and based on modern approaches to clinical psychotherapy. In this context, the clinicians themselves do the shrinking. For example, they help to shrink overwhelmingly large or anxiety-inducing problems that clients and patients have so that these issues can be more objectively examined, understood, and dealt with. Or they help to shrink outsized, inflated perceptions of the self through a process of encouraging self-reflection and personal accountability. Also, today's fun fact: in some cases, long-term use of antipsychotic medications can actually alter people's brain volume. Probably unrelated, but hey, still interesting. In all likelihood, the true reason for the widespread use of the term shrink probably comes from a combination of all three origin stories. However, like I alluded to at the beginning of this video, it's now somewhat outdated. So why did it fall out of use? Well, over time, it's gained somewhat of a negative connotation. It originated from traditions and practices considered superstitious and unscientific by today's standards, the very types of classifications that rightfully rub any healthcare provider, including mental health providers, the wrong way. And although your average individual may not be aware of the history of this term, it's clear that those origins have seeped into the undertone it carries. Furthermore, reducing the use of the term has also fallen in line with the push to reduce stigma more generally around treatment for mental health. In many ways, tracing the origins of this nickname is a fascinating reminder of just how far the profession's come. That's all for now. If you're interested in more deep dives like this, or some of the topics covered in this video, then please check out my channel and like and subscribe for future content. Thanks so much for watching. It was alright. A bit sweet for me, but who knows? You might have an even bigger sweet tooth than I do.